Hi everyone. Thanks for joining me. In December 2013, an article by Chris Hedges was published on the news website Truthdig. The article was about the shockingly poor levels of food quality in US prisons. Quote, "The food doled out to prisoners was not only substandard, but often spoiled," end quote. Crystal Jordan had complained numerous times about the state of food in Burlington County Jail. In 2013, she'd been a corrections officer in New Jersey for the last 23 years. I don't know what she's been doing since then. According to Jordan, quote, "The big shift came in 2004 when the state got rid of employees who worked in the kitchen. The food was not great prior to 2004, but the officers ate it along with the prisoners. Once Aramark came in, that changed. The bread was stale. I saw food in the kitchen with mould on it. The refrigerator broke down and the food was left outside in the cold or trucked in from another facility. Those who ate the food began to get sick," end quote. Now, this isn't the only time that Aramark have ever been called out for poor service. They're kind of known for it at this point. But there's one more headline I wanted to show you from 2014. You're probably wondering if I made a mistake with the title of this video. But I didn't. And this is possibly one of the least concerning aspects of direct provision. So having said all that, let's get cracking. Now, according to my YouTube analytics, most of my viewers come from outside of Ireland. So as opposed to just jumping in and telling you what's wrong with direct provision, I'm going to be going through bit by bit, giving as much context as possible. That might be a bit boring for some of you who kind of are up to speed basically on what direct provision is and the ins and outs of it, but I think it's important to do it this way. Also, according to my YouTube analytics, none of you are subscribed. I don't know what the story is with that, but maybe you want to sort it out? Maybe? I don't know. I don't post often. It's barely a video a month. I'm not going to annoy you that much. You might as well just subscribe. Anyway, direct provision is overseen by... Oh, wait, hang on. I need to prepare myself for this one. Direct provision is overseen by the International Protection Accommodation Service, which is part of the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, although the International Protection Accommodation Service was actually formerly known as the Reception and Integration Agency, and the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth was formerly known as the Department of Foreign Affairs, which was originally overseen by the Department of Justice. Got it? Great. Me neither. Let's move on. According to the blurb on the International Protection Accommodation Service website, quote, "Direct provision is a means of meeting the basic needs of food and shelter for asylum seekers directly while their claims for refugee status are being processed, rather than through full cash payments. Direct provision commenced on the 10th of April 2000, from which time asylum seekers have received full board accommodation and, currently, personal allowances of €21.60 per adult and €21.60 per child per week," end quote. Now, those figures are misleading, but we'll get into that later. Put a pin in that. Direct provision was first implemented by the Fianna Fáil and Progressive Democrat coalition government in the year 2000. It was TD John O'Donoghue who was in the position of Minister for Justice at the time, and it was an attempt to try and deal with the enormous influx of asylum seekers. Quote, "Those who are found to be genuine refugees must be fully integrated and enjoy all the rights that go with that status, and immigrants generally, irrespective of their status, or whether they happen to be here illegally, must also have their human rights fully respected, and, in particular, we must ensure that our immigrants are not allowed to become the subject of criminal or racist attacks. We must not allow internationally organised criminal gangs to perpetrate large-scale fraud by means of illegal traffic and exploitation of human beings. We must deal firmly but fairly with those who are found to have entered our jurisdiction illegally," end quote. What a weird final sentence to throw in there, huh? Especially when you're trying to implement a lovely, fair system of asylum. It's strange. Took a bit of a turn. Also, this is a side note for future Paul. This is so goddamn similar to, it reminds me of, who's that? Who's like, "Oh yeah, love for all, I'm so happy, but these fucking gators are eating people in Queensland," where the fuck it was. I'm going to pop it on screen because I want to watch it again.
I mean, people are entitled to their sexual proclivities, I mean, let there be 1,000 blossoms bloom as far as I'm concerned, But I ain't spending any time on it because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Anyway, I'm sure direct provision was set up in good faith by a man who eventually had to resign from his job for fraudulent expense claims to the tune of almost €500,000 in 2009. I'm sure his greed had very little to do with setting up a system to provide accommodation to asylum seekers, which is basically just the government working in tandem with third-party for-profit companies. The entire process was really pushed forward by a common fear of outsiders that Ireland had at the time, and, being honest, still does have. Examples of this are an article from 1997 in the Evening Herald which reads, "Refugees get £20 million payments," or from 2002 in the Daily Mirror which says, "Free cars for refugees, cash grant by BMWs." A Cork North Central TD, Noel O'Flynn, referred to asylum seekers as, quote, "spongers, freeloaders and people screwing the system," end quote, and that Ireland should, quote, "shut its doors on immigrants, many of whom are thumbing their noses at Irish hospitality," end quote. By the way, he said this during the 2002 general election campaign, and kinda served him well. Also, sorry, did I say a common fear of outsiders earlier on? I meant brown outsiders, obviously. It's a very important distinction to make, and it's almost as though I left it out on purpose, for emphasis. All of this led up to the referendum in 2004, where the Irish public voted to remove the right to citizenship from children who were born on the island if their parents were not citizens. This was a referendum tabled by Fianna Fáil and the Progressive Democrat government who brought in direct provision in the first place. It was also supported by the main opposition party, Fine Gael. Now, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are both in power together now, but they don't tend to mention this referendum too much. Strange. But I'm sure they're doing all they can to support asylum seekers. History has no bearing on the present, right? So what is the process of direct provision? We know what it is and where it came from, but what's it for? So a person has to stay in a detention centre. Direct provision centre. Don't know how I confused those two. They have to stay in the centre if they're awaiting the results of a few different processes. A decision on their initial application, the result of an appeal of their initial application, a judicial review where the High Court basically looks at how a decision on their application was made, a decision on whether or not they'll be given leave to remain, or a decision on their deportation. Now this all sounds pretty okay, right? Like it's a sellable enough system. People come in, they apply for asylum, and while they're waiting for a decision, they get food and shelter and some money. What are you complaining about, Paul? Sign me up. But obviously, I've made a video about this, so it's not that simple. Like all things, once you peel back the cover, you see what truly lies beneath. And by peel back the cover, I mean like just listening to what asylum seekers have to say for basically the first time ever. Unsurprisingly, asylum seekers are more likely to be diagnosed with mental health illnesses like depression or PTSD. In fact, studies have shown that asylum seekers are 5 times more likely to have mental health needs than the general population. And more than 61% of asylum seekers will experience serious mental distress. Studies also show that they're less likely to receive support with these issues than the general population. There are currently 38 direct provision centres across Ireland and roughly 7,400 people housed in these facilities. These centres are often far outside of towns and cities, causing a sense of isolation among those who have, being honest, already given up everything. And this isolation exacerbates already underlying issues. Now you might be a bit shocked by those numbers. 38 centres with 7,400 people. Those are big buildings, right? 38 buildings, like 200-ish rooms in a building? No. No. Let's look at an example, shall we? Mount Tranchard is a direct provision centre in Limerick. It's 40 kilometres away from Limerick Village and has 85 residents spread out over, guess how many rooms? Why don't you have a guess? We'll make this interactive. Eighteen rooms. All but 2 of the rooms in this centre are a minimum of 4 people to a room. I'd also like to point out that Mount Tranchard is a former hotel. So imagine 4+ beds squeezed into a single occupancy room that you've stayed in, and you can imagine the overcrowding and cramped conditions. Now, I try to avoid mentioning COVID as much as possible in my videos because so many problems can be written off by simply saying that COVID came out of nowhere and took everyone by surprise. The overcrowding in direct provision centres is a dream come true for COVID, due to the ease in which it can spread, and it has spread, but also the lack of available spaces for self-isolation. Now, obviously, COVID did come from nowhere and take everyone by surprise. I'm not saying that it didn't, but this overcrowding is a problem across the entire system, and it has been for a long time. So while you may see tables that show that there are some centres which are below capacity, that basically just means that they have spare beds. Under capacity does not mean increased privacy. Mount Tranchard is a male-only centre, one of only 8 centres in total which are gender segregated. 7 male, 1 female. The one centre for women has a capacity of 55 people. Now, considering the fact that in 2012, 56 of the new women who discussed their survival with the Rape Crisis Centre were in direct provision, that number is simply not adequate. According to the UN Refugee Agency, quote, the mixed gender housing and direct provision system, a system originally established to provide services for asylum seekers, had inadequate privacy, was unsuitable and potentially unsafe for traumatised victims, could expose them to greater exploitation and undermine victim recovery, end quote. Now, that's not great, I hear you understating. Why don't the government just open up more centres which are single sex? But yeah, about that. The government only run 7 of the 38 centres. But even those 7 aren't actually run by the government own them. The actual running of the centres is outsourced. But we'll get more into that later. Going alongside all this is the fact that a majority of these holding pens, again, I don't know why I keep doing that, a majority of these direct provision centres don't have kitchen facilities. Well, they do have kitchen facilities, just not available to the people there. They mostly have set meal times, meaning that if someone in direct provision is able to actually make it to a nearby town, they won't even be able to stay long enough to integrate with the community. Do you want to stay out to meet people and not eat? It's not a good idea. People need food. Hot take, I know. And I know there's going to be some people who say like, well, they don't need the food supplied to them. They can just get a job and they won't need to rely on the food they're being given. That's a great idea, which I'm sure 70% of the people in direct provision would love to do. They'd love to get a job. Hold on to that 70%, I'll explain that in a minute too. Up until recently, those in direct provision couldn't actually work. A decision was made in 2018 which declared that those who had been in direct provision for 6 months would be able to work, assuming they can find work. And if they can find work, assuming they can actually make it to their jobs. Let's not forget a majority of direct provision centres are pretty far from towns and cities. But anyway, we'll ignore that. At least now there's a chance they'll no longer need to live off the pittance supplied to them by the state. The quote I gave earlier on from the government department who looks after this, when it said that they received $21.60 per week, that's now. From the year 2000 until 2016, they received €19.10 per adult and €9.60 per child. This was increased in 2016 to the numbers quoted and then again in 2019, although shockingly, some members of the government didn't want this to happen. Strange. But they have such a good history with asylum seekers. Still, at least this means that those in direct provision can, hypothetically, afford to miss one of their mandated meal times. That makes it sound like a prison, but I'm just going to roll with it now. It just seems to be happening. At least they'll be getting something edible. That Truthdig article I mentioned at the beginning of the video, oh so many years ago, was titled Prison Food That Isn't Fit for Your Dog, which is pretty accurate to be honest. NASC, the Irish Immigrant Support Centre, published a paper called What's Food Got to Do With It? All about the quality of food and the general structure of meal times in direct provision. And it's 62 pages long. 62 pages of issue after issue, problem after problem. While I go through some of these issues, I'm going to be showing you some images of food from these Gael Bay centres. They're not pretty, they don't look great, they're pretty gross, but I had to look at them, so you will too. Here we go. In general, the food in direct provision is described as, quote, dissatisfactory, repetitive and bland, cooked incorrectly, and often inedible, end quote. Mealtimes themselves are, quote, extremely stressful and not conducive to enjoying mealtimes, especially due to security being present in the room, end quote. Due to all this, many of the people in direct provision will spend what little money they have on their own food and store it in their room, pretty much always unhygienically, in order to avoid eating the food being served there, but also to avoid the environment of the dining area. There's also no regard given for dietary requirements for health reasons or moral reasons or religious reasons. What's that? You don't eat pork? Fuck you, you're getting pork. Need your food to be halal? Eat it or eat nothing. I don't give a shit. On top of all of this, due to the fact that a majority of direct provision centres don't allow residents to make their own food, there's no acknowledgement of particular meals for religious holidays. I mean, imagine being British and St. George's Day rolls around and you can't have your traditional meal of Cornish pasties and a pint of bitter piss. I mean, just imagine. It's heartbreaking for you, I know. And on top of all that, the food served doesn't even meet the dietary requirements of the children in direct provision. Oh, what's that? I haven't mentioned children yet. Wrong. Remember earlier on when I told you to hold on to that 70%? That 70% were the people in direct provision who'd love to be able to work. About 30% of those in direct provision are children. There's also an unknown amount of children who have been born in direct provision. And I'm not saying that hyperbolically either. The Department of Justice said the figures are, quote, not readily available, end quote. That's comforting, isn't it? But children, born in direct provision. First of all, don't worry, it's a very equal system. The children born in direct provision are treated just as terribly as the adults. Secondly, this is assuming that those who are pregnant actually give birth. There were 44 recorded deaths in the direct provision system between 2007 and 2017, including 3 stillbirths and 1 neonatal death. I say recorded deaths because the numbers are pretty fuzzy. Up until 2003, the government didn't keep records of those who died in direct provision, and then from 2003 until 2017, they kind of did, although we'll get into those in a second, and then from 2017 on, they decided to not do so again for some fucking reason. So looking at the deaths from 2007 until 2017 shows us just how little humanity is given to those in direct provision. 3 of those who died had their cause of death down as suicide. In 15 of the cases, the suspected cause of death was marked down as unknown or simply just died. According to the Irish Catholic, via a Freedom of Information request with the RIA, quote, among those listed as unknown was a 41-year-old man who was found in room by roommate in 2008, a 53-year-old man who was found dead in his bed at 9 a.m. by his roommate in 2012, a 35-year-old man found unconscious in room and died in hospital in 2014, and another man in 2015 found unconscious in room and died in hospital. End quote. Father Paddy Byrne is a priest in Portlaoise who was interviewed by the Irish Catholic because he'd recently presided over a funeral of a person who was living in direct provision. He said, quote, I can only call it a horror story of a young woman who was forgotten by this society, who never felt hospitality or welcome, who was imprisoned because of her identity, and who died unknown. End quote. And I hope you're all okay after that last part. I know it got a bit heavy at the end there. You're probably wondering how a system so clearly broken can continue to be in place. Like, what is it about this system that keeps it going? It's not the treatment of the human beings, that's obvious. It's obviously not efficient, it's not cheap to run, so what could it be? What could it be? Why am I even fucking pretending like neither of us know the answer? It's fucking capitalism. Of course it's capitalism. Jesus Christ, it's always capitalism. From the year 2000, when direct provision was started, until 2017, when the government decided to just stop recording the cost of direct provision, because why the fuck would you want to know that, I suppose? The Irish state paid over €1 billion to third parties for direct provision. Well, at least €1.1 billion. I say at least because this is the overall cost paid to the companies who run direct provision centres. This cost does not include any additional payments which might have been made to the companies. So let's look at some examples, shall we? Mosney Holiday plc, which is owned by Phelim and Elizabeth McCloskey, who purely coincidentally, are financial donors to Fianna Fáil, is the company which runs the Mosney Direct Provision Centre in Meath. Mosney has received over €139 million as of 2017. East Coast Catering, owned by Canada-based Irishman Patrick O'Callaghan, has earned over €130 million. Barlow Group is run by Alan Hyde, and that operates 7 different centres around Ireland, earned them over €57 million. In one of these centres, almost half of the detainees are torture victims. This centre has been the site of protests, hunger strikes, and detainee uprisings over the conditions, which the Irish Refugee Council describes as, quote, one of the worst in the system, end quote. This centre is Mount Tranchard, as I said before. Once you start to dig down pretty much any direction, you start to see the rot.
He said it!
But what about Aramark? Well, I don't really know. We know that they received just over €5 million in 2016. Look, okay, we mostly don't know because Aramark's earnings are tied up with all their other earnings in Ireland. Aramark operate about 50% of all catering in Ireland, by the way. But also, we don't know because in Ireland, Aramark are an unlimited company. Sounds exciting, Paul. Tell me more, I hear you say. Okay, mysterious stranger. Unlimited companies in Ireland mean a lot of good things for rich people, but it also means that the company does not need to disclose their finances publicly. That's nice enough, isn't it? Like, they're not hiding anything, though. Loads of companies do this in Ireland, like Johnson & Johnson, and Etsy, and Dropbox, and Airbnb, and LinkedIn, and Apple and Google. All paragons of virtue, I'm sure we'd agree. Now, a lot of you are sitting there thinking either direct provision can fuck off, or you're thinking, yeah, typical lefty, complain about the system because it's popular to complain about the system. Which is fair enough, but I'd like to point out that the cost of direct provision itself is something which has been called out by the Department of Justice. In its 2019 report, the Department of Justice states that one of the ways we could improve on direct provision would be to have fewer commercially owned facilities, noting that, quote, commercially owned centres' operation costs are approximately 44% more per person per day than state-owned centres, end quote. Also, this isn't just a lefty thing. I want to give you one more quote before we go to the conclusion. And this is from the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the UN Independent Expert on Human Rights and Extreme Poverty. Quote, the committee is concerned at the negative impact that the policy of direct provision has had on the welfare of asylum seekers who, due to the inordinate delay in the process of their applications and the final outcomes of their appeals and reviews, as well as poor living conditions, can suffer health and psychological problems that in certain cases lead to serious mental illness. The committee is further concerned by the failure by the state party to provide for an independent appeals tribunal, considering that the remit of the Office of the Ombudsman does not extend to asylum and immigration matters. The committee encourages the state party to take all necessary steps with a view to expediting the process of asylum applications so that asylum seekers do not spend unreasonable periods of time in asylum centres, which might have negative consequences on their health and general welfare. The state party should take all necessary measures to improve the living conditions of asylum seekers by providing them with adequate food, medical care, and other social amenities, including also a review of the direct provision system itself. End quote. The Irish government announced that there would no longer be direct provision centres by the end of 2024, which could be a good thing, although considering the fact that they said direct provision itself would be a good thing, and they've said that quite a few times since its inception, I'm not too optimistic about this change. We mustn't forget, this decision, much like the decision on same-sex marriage, on abortion, on gender recognition, these were all ignored or completely avoided by the government until our calls for action became too much to ignore. For almost 25 years, the government did absolutely nothing to attempt to address the awful conditions for those in direct provision in any way, leading to mental health issues, physical health issues, and, as I've sadly pointed out, to death. We must never again allow our government to act against the interests of fellow human beings. We must not allow ministers to fucking spew this right-wing talking points at us to try and pander to the fears about foreigners. To sell our freedom and safety to corporations. They'll try to do it anyway, they always do. It's what they do. We've seen this time and time again. We also can't avoid the very blatant racism within Ireland when it comes to asylum seekers and refugees. You'll often hear, if they don't like all the free stuff, why don't they just leave? They're treated better here than they would be in the country they came from. But none of that is saying much, and that bar is so low it's lying on the fucking ground. Those who oppose direct provision need to be sure that the people we're fighting alongside are opposed to direct provision for the right reasons. Now that might sound very judgmental and very kind of gatekeepy, but this is very important to point out. There have been numerous attacks on migrants and on direct provision centres themselves. These attacks have gone as far as to burn down entire centres. Fascists, racists, right-wingers, they all oppose direct provision. But the reason for doing so is very different to ours. And their outcome of abolishing direct provision would be very different from ours. We find ourselves in a position where we need to ask how many people is it okay to harm? As far as I'm concerned, the answer is 0. Now, I've been going through direct provision stuff online, and of course I ended up at Twitter, and I saw somebody saying that changing direct provision was kind of like the trolley problem thing. Do we continue doing what we're doing and harm as many people as we are, or do we pull the lever, not knowing whether amending the system now could result in further harm? It's not really analogous to what I'm suggesting, because I don't think we should pull the lever. I think we should build a completely new track. The history of the Irish government working in tandem with third parties to provide institutional accommodation should be all the evidence we need that amending a broken system simply does not work. When there is an ulterior motive for these third parties to be a part of the system will do nothing but neglect and abuse in order to achieve their desired ends, regardless of the means. Thanks for watching, everyone.